All right, hello everybody. This is AP Bio Unit 7, Topics 4, 5, and 12 on evolution. We'll go ahead and get started here today. So, there's a couple terms you need to be aware of within population genetics, and the first one's pretty straightforward. Population, okay? A population would be a group of individuals of the same species that live in the same area and interbreed to make fertile offspring. Okay? There are some biological breeding events that result in non fertile offspring. Okay? Worker bees, donkeys, and horses give you mules, which are non-fertile. Okay, so there are certain types.
Liger, one of them too.
Yeah, ligers would be an example. There are special twins within cows. Anytime cows have twin babies, they tend to be sterile. They're called free martins. I don't know where that name comes from, but it's because they're exposed to both male and female hormones during pregnancy, and they just really, especially the males, well, I think it's actually both. I'm not sure. I'd have to check, but they don't tend to be fertile. Okay, so you can still have breedings without fertility. Now, that doesn't mean an occasional one is going to turn the whole system upside down, but you have to have some sort of breeding. Examples of populations that are sort of like side by side. There are animals on one side of the Grand Canyon and the other side of the Grand Canyon. Those are two populations. They don't interbreed. Okay, now there may be some sort of migrant that makes its way across or something like that, but in general, those populations are independent of one another. Okay. There's before the Panama Canal was built, there were certain types of aquatic life on one side versus I guess it would be marine life on one side versus the other side. Now they can kind of get through there, and they've kind of tracked how that has affected the genetics of different animals in that area. So populations can be intermixed through human intervention, and sometimes it can have, undesirable results or interesting results. So populations are somewhat, I shouldn't say somewhat, they are in a distinct area, and they don't typically leave the area. Okay? So that's the definition of population that you should be aware of. So start thinking of evolution in terms of populations. One of the big sort of like driving misconceptions is that individuals evolve. Only populations can evolve. All right, so what is a gene pool? Okay, a gene pool is the genetic makeup of a population. Okay, so the gene pool for, let's say the whole school was a gene pool. Okay, some of you may end up marrying and having offspring with some of the people that walk around here, right? High school sweethearts. Some of you are shaking your head no. I understand. All right. But it happens, okay? It happens. Maybe not you, but somebody, right? Can you at least grant me that? So if we just said the high school was a population, you had to pick your mate out of this population, you might take all the genes for, let's go with, I don't know, hemophilia, and put them all in a database. That would be the gene pool. Okay? You could do the same thing with height, eye color, hair color, whatever. Okay? And it's all the genes together is the gene pool. It's almost like we dump them all in a pool. Okay? So, the gene pool. There's a joke about the shallow end of the gene pool. Some of you are swimming in the shallow end. You get the joke? Your genes aren't that great. All right. So if there is only, listen, if there's only one allele present for a particular location on a gene, then it's fixed. So let's say the gene for hemophilia, let's say nobody in the high school has that trait, okay? Let's go with big H, little h, okay? You'd be a carrier, little, you'd have the trait. Let's say there are 0 little h's in the entire high school. You would be, that population would never get hemophilia. Does that make sense? Okay, so that gene would be fixed, it wouldn't change. The gene pool doesn't have any diversity. In this case, it's a negative trait, so it's kind of a good thing. So, when we look at fixed alleles, we can look at a gene pool and say, well, there's not much genetic diversity in that gene pool, okay? Or there's a lot of genetic diversity in that gene pool. Now, this particular school is very, very diverse. We probably have a really, really rich gene pool. If you would go to like a community where there's very little interaction with the outside world, the gene pool would be way less diverse. An example here in Ohio would be the Amish population, okay? You don't really see a lot of people coming into the Amish population. Now, there are lots of people that will leave that particular group, okay? That's fine. But you don't see many like new people coming into the Amish population, right? So that gene pool is very fixed, and the genetic diversity of that gene pool, because there's lots of intermarrying, okay, it's not like they're marrying their siblings, but it's a small fixed population, okay? So the genetic diversity of that kind of gene pool is going to be way lower than a broad, bigger population where people are coming and going from all over the world, okay? So I think you could kind of compare that to animals. Start thinking about some of the endangered animals in the world. What would you expect their gene pool to be if we tried to revitalize the species? Let's go with something like rhinos. How many of those are left to certain subspecies? Some of them are considered non-viable. There's only like a few of them left. If we were ever able to revive them, their gene pool would be super, super fixed, okay? Which leads to problems down the line. Examples of that are also in certain breeds of dogs, certain, like labs and pugs and whatever, okay? So these are things that you've probably got some familiarity with on a certain level, even if you're not using the right terms, okay? All right, let's talk about that gene pool just a little bit more. I have for you a very small population. This population only has 4 individuals. That's not really desirable, but if I put a whole bunch up, it'd be hard to see, okay? Here are all their genotypes. All right, here's my pool. High-end graphics today. If I put all those genes in there, that is my gene pool. That's as simple as it is right there, okay? Now, I only picked one particular set of traits here. If I was going to be more honest about this, I would pick the mouse, its entire genetic makeup, okay? But just for teaching purposes and keeping it simple, I'm only showing one trait at a time, okay? So there's our gene pool. And we can mix that up, and it really doesn't matter which way we do it. It's still the same gene pool. All right, so what we're going to start looking at are population genetics, okay? If we look at a population's alleles, we will see that those frequencies of alleles, when I say frequency, that just means how frequent it happens, okay? If you say, like, I eat ice cream frequently, that means you eat it very often. So don't get, like, This is not really the physics frequency, even though they are the same thing, how often a wave happens. But anyway, populations are what is going to be evolving, not individuals. We do not see individuals evolving, populations evolve. Okay? So, microevolution are small scale genetic changes in a population. And those are driven by random occurrences. Okay? Mutations are random. Genetic drift is random. Migration and gene flow are random. Natural selection is random, like what things in the environment are going to change the occurrence of the frequency of the alleles. Okay, these are a list of them. We're going to talk about these individually, so just stick with me. Okay, we've already learned about mutations, so just really quick in your head right now, on the side of your notes, jot down what is a mutation. Just jot it down real quick. What's a mutation? Just a review. You don't have to look it up, just kind of like from memory, what's a mutation? What's a mutation? All right, a mutation is any change in the genetic makeup of an individual due to some random factor. They can just happen randomly from DNA proofreading not being exactly right. It could be some mutagen in the environment. That's something that causes mutations. Radiations and chemicals are one of the things that can do that. Mutations usually are not helpful, but every once in a while we get one that is. No mutation, very, very little evolution. Okay? So mutations result in new genetic variation, and when these show up, we get new alleles, and we get natural selection acting on these new phenotypes. Okay, let's take a look at some things about mutations here. Mutations tend to be very slow in plants and animals because we have such a long generation time. Think about how long it will be for even a fast reproducing mammal to change its gene pool compared to a bacteria. Okay? Even a fast reproducing mammal like mice can reproduce very quickly, cats can reproduce very quickly, they have a somewhat large amount of babies. Compared to bacteria though, that's moving in slow motion. Bacteria can reproduce every 4 or 5 hours. If conditions are right, they double. And so we have this huge exponential rate of growth. Mammals and plants, I keep saying mammals, I really mean animals. Animals, way slower most of the time, even if they're fast reproducing. Then you take things that are slow reproducing, like humans and elephants. We only have one baby at a time. We tend to have a long time between birth and when you have another generation. Okay, most people are waiting till they're in their 20s to have children. Okay, so we only have a couple children. It's not like, most families aren't 19 and counting or whatever it is. So any mutation that ends up in animal and plant populations typically goes slow. Many plants only flower once a year. Okay, a lot of trees and things like that, even though they give off lots of seeds, they might not have many of those actually reach reproductive maturity. So just keep that in mind. If you're going to study evolution, bacteria are way easier than, big animals. So mutations can be harmful, neutral, or beneficial. Okay? Most are neutral and harmful. Not all mutations lead to evolution. Okay? So just keep that in mind. Keep that in mind. Can somebody shut that door for us? All right, let's talk about what genetic drift is. Okay, these are chance events that cause a change in allele frequency from one generation to the next. This is most significant in small populations. There was a question in our DDT mosquito review on why the gene showed up very quickly in the lab versus out in nature. Well, small populations are way more subjected to genetic drift and fast changes. Okay? So genetic drift might happen in a small population. Let's say there's a gene, let's go with big A, little a, and one generation, little a just doesn't show up very often. Okay, that could be genetic drift because the next generation it's going to show up even less often. Okay, so what this can be really interesting to study in like royal families, which is why they come up all the time in biology classes and on biology quizzes and tests. Okay, royal family stuff. Those people are a small population that only kind of intermarries within people of that class. Okay, so if your ancestors only married each other, that's a very small population. If you were like a peasant and people just married all over the place, you probably you don't have to worry about this as much. So this can cause harmful alleles to become fixed, and that's because we have people who have harmful alleles mating and reproducing with people that also have harmful alleles, and just by random chance they can start showing up more often. Okay? So this usually doesn't make adaptations. Okay? Genetic drift just kind of changes the population, not through adaptation. It's random. Two really well-known examples are the bottleneck effect and founder effect. Does anybody know what we mean when we say bottleneck? Well, just in general, if I say there's a bottleneck on Sawmill Road, what's that mean? Like everything comes down to a narrow point and only a few can get through at a time, okay? They call it a bottleneck because if you take like a bottle, the skinny opening at the top, you can only pour out so fast, right? All right. So let's just make sure we know what bottleneck means. So here's an actual bottleneck, okay? So you might see something like this when a subpopulation migrates. Well, that's the founder effect. Never mind. So a bottleneck is when a large population is reduced by some natural disaster that's non-selecting. Okay? So any kind of big flood, famine, fire, hurricane, hunting. The hunting could be by humans, or it could just be by introducing a new species to the area. Okay? We will get some bottlenecking occurring. So take a look at this cartoon here on the right. It looks like there are three different traits in the bottle. You've got the green, what I'm going to call pink, and then you've got a couple of these bright red individuals. Let's say a flood comes through and kills everybody in the bottle, but a few of them survive. Okay? What you'll see is usually some diversity gets eliminated. Okay? Maybe a whole allele that was present in the population gets eliminated. Using mathematics, there are people that study this, and they'll look at populations and they'll say, at one time it was likely the whole human race was down to 300 individuals. Or at one time it's likely that this population of cheetahs or whatever was down to so many individuals due to a bottleneck event. So using geologic records like volcanoes and floods, and then comparing them to what's going on in the gene pool, we can kind of discover these. Okay, we can look at this and go, well, there had to be some bottleneck event that happened because that gene disappeared from the population. So you may see alleles that were present in the population before just vanish or underrepresent. Let me ask you this. Look at the cartoon. How many red ones are shown in the bottle? I can only see 6, I think. What if 2 red ones ended up in that population? What would happen to red as time went forward, as the population reestablished? It would be way more prevalent than it was in the past. So bottlenecks can make things go both ways. So think of bottlenecks as disasters. I was thinking like breaking the bottle. That's a disaster. All right. So that's a bottleneck. Founder effect, it's very easy to mix up because it's sort of the same mechanism. You start with a whole bunch and you go to a limited amount. The founder effect happens when a few individuals become isolated from a large population, okay? And they start with a small population that differs from the large population. It doesn't have to be missing an allele. It's just going to sort of change the frequency of the alleles compared to before over time. You might see this, okay, where somebody, a small subpopulation immigrates to a new area, okay? In humans, there are lots of examples of that, but usually after a couple generations, people start saying, I don't want to marry somebody from my group. I'm going to marry someone outside the group. But there's a lot of times people will maintain that, and you'll see this founder effect happen, say, when a certain religious subgroup moves to a new area and it sticks to itself pretty tightly. But you also see it a lot with animals that get moved around. We see this all the way back to the fossil record when continents moved around, but we also see it with any kind of population, any kind of group of animals that gets moved, okay? Like, let's say that you are going to, if you're a farmer and you take some sort of animals away and you're like, I'm going to go start a new farm on, in Australia, okay? You'll see a founder effect. So founder effects involve migration. They involve movement, or they involve any kind of cut off from the original population, okay? The big deal with founder effects is you're starting with a smaller amount. A large population goes to a small population by being isolated, okay? What's the difference between these two? In this one, everybody in the bottle dies, okay? And they stay in the same spot. In this one, there's some sort of isolation that happens due to them founding a new group, all right? So, the third one we're going to look at is gene flow, okay? Here we have 2 populations of birds. They're red and they're blue, and they are on different sides of some geographical boundary. In this case, it's a mountain. Okay? Just because of the size of the mountain and maybe the conditions and just how far the bird's behavior is on moving away from its home area, there are isolations that happens, but it's not total isolation. Okay? So gene flow happens when alleles are transferred to new locations. Okay? We used to have a program here when I first started teaching here 20 years ago. If you guys remember Mr. Watkins, we had turtles that lived out back before that development was over there on the other side of that walking trail. We would put radio tags on the turtles. We'd go out there with antennas and they would, beep, beep, beep. We'd track them down. There are some types of turtles that stay in a certain area and they do not move. And so those are sort of, they don't roam. There are other types of turtles that were known to like really roam and just mate all over the place. So some of them are going to lead to gene flow and some of them don't. That was actually like a behavior that was recognized in that box turtle species. So it's kind of neat how gene flow works. Sometimes it can just be like random. Like pollen does not have a, pollen just goes where the wind blows it. But some animals actually have sort of it seems, a gene flow behavior. So this is when we see alleles transfer from one population to the other. And it's usually just a small number of individuals. This is sort of like the foreign exchange student that comes to your high school. If we keep using the high school as a gene pool. All right. So there are 3 different choices here. Okay? Bottleneck, founder, or genetic drift. Just kind of keep track of your score on your own. We'll just go through some examples. You tell me what they are. You have these black robins in New Zealand. Their habitat was destroyed, and we got down to 5 individuals. And now we're back up to 230. Which one is this? Bottleneck. Okay. You're looking for bottleneck. That's right. Look at that picture very carefully. Yeah, he's probably a good guitar player, piano player. Polydactyly is actually a dominant trait. Yeah. So most people have recessive, 2 recessive alleles. So if it shows up in your family, it's going to stay. I knew a girl in high school who had it, but a girl I knew in high school had it. Her mom had extra toes, but all she had was a webbed thumb. So her thumb had 2 bones after this joint right here, and she had like a line that went down the middle of her thumb. Okay. So back to the question. What is this one? That's the founder effect. You're right. Okay. So we have a natural disaster, so that makes this a This is a bottleneck. Here we have some long distance breeding. What's this one going to be? Gene flow. Okay. Good way to remember this is like the pollen literally flows on the wind. Okay. Or I'm going to flow over to the next town and spread my genes. Okay. All right. So, how are we doing on time? I'm going to go ahead and we'll go a little bit farther, okay, and then we'll wrap it up. So now, listen, we know about natural selection from earlier lectures. Let's look a little bit about how it can affect a population. So natural selection, when we think about natural selection, we think about reproductive success. And reproductive success, we talked about this already, is relative fitness. Okay, relative fitness is the number of offspring an individual produces compared to others in the population. Now, that doesn't mean like the number of rabbit babies there are compared to the number of wolves there are. That means the number of rabbit babies there are compared to the rabbits in the next rabbit hold over. Okay? So if your offspring have any kind of phenotype that gives them any kind of advantage, we should see some natural selection start coming into play. And how would we know that was happening? We would look at the changes in the phenotypes. So there's 3 ways that natural selection can happen, and you have to know all 3 of them. Let's take a look. We have directional, stabilizing, and disruptive. Okay? These are pretty easy because the terms are very descriptive. All right, so the red is what the population originally looked like. Okay, the red is what the population originally looked like. In directional selection, we would go toward one extreme phenotype. The peppered moths would be a good example of this. Okay? In stabilizing selection, we would go against the extremes. Okay? This might be something that's speckled, and being all one color or all the other color is bad because it makes you less camouflaged. That's called stabilizing. And disruptive is the opposite, okay? You get 2 new extremes, okay? 2 new extremes. Disruptive, I knew you were going to ask me that, and I can't think of the example. There's like a really good classic example. Give me a second and I'll tell you. It's within the same population. Those will be subpopulations. Okay. I want to look at sexual selection really briefly. Sexual selection explains why many species have unique traits or showy behaviors. I'm sure you've seen this in nature documentaries and things. Okay? You've got birds that have really flashy feathers. Okay? I want you really see this, it's called sexual dimorphism. That's where males and females look very different. Humans have that. Okay? Some of it's cultural. Okay? Like long hair is usually a female trait, but in modern times, short hair is usually a male trait. Not always, but it's just kind of something that's cultural. Okay. Body shape in humans is obviously, we don't have to go very far to understand that. But this is really easy to see in a lot of bird species. Okay. What's the Ohio State bird? Cardinal. Okay. And so male cardinals are bright red. What do female cardinals look like? They're brown. They're kind of like whatever. All right? So that's sexual dimorphism. Peacocks do it. You also see behaviors, okay? Have you ever seen these birds that do like these funky dances and things like that? So usually this is because females choose that trait more. And so, on a genetic level, we usually don't see females looking at males and going, man, I bet that one has really good genes and will be a really good dad. That's not really how it works, okay? Females that pick showy males are selected for. Okay, I want you to think about that for a second. Females that are choosy are selected for. Just keep that in mind. So usually in any species that has sexual selection, usually we see this sort of behavior, okay? Males compete and females choose, okay? So this is not in the notes, but we usually see males competing. Like, who can show off the most for the females, okay? And then you see females are usually very, very choosy. Now, let's get into some of the actual sort of biological cost of sex, okay? If you're male, you make thousands of sperm a day, and you can just keep making them every day. How much does it cost you in terms of biology, not in terms of child support, to cause a pregnancy? Not much, okay? Costs you a little bit of time, okay? And that's pretty much it. What if you're female and you suddenly become pregnant? What does it cost you? A lot, okay? It costs you a lot in terms of, well, now I'm pregnant and I have to invest thousands of calories into this pregnancy, okay? Don't even think about it as if like, well, now my career is on hold, or now I have to drop out of school. Like, now I have to hire a babysitter. Just consider it biologically. But all those things, when it comes to human behavior, they still exist, okay? They still exist. And so, usually you see males compete to fertilize as many females as possible, okay? And usually you see females being very picky about who's going to fertilize them, okay? People who study this in humans did this really famous experiment where they had actors just walk up to random members of the opposite sex, and what they just said, would you like to go home and sleep with me? Okay? And they had male actors do it and female actors do it. They did it in multiple places in the world. How many females do you think said sure? One. Okay? The people who did it were rated as average attractive, So they didn't want to have like rocks, Harry Styles going and say, all right. So then they had women do it to men. How many men do you think said yeah? A lot, okay? I don't have the exact numbers, but a lot. Okay, I want to throw some interesting side experiments related to this, okay? They did it again, and they had the men hold guitars. All they did was carry a guitar around. And then they did it with like a sports bag, and then they did it with nothing. Do you think it changed the results? Yes, it did, okay? And for some reason, this goes into the showy thing, okay? You see animals that perform and display be chosen more often by females, okay? So women found guys holding guitars more acceptable as mates. They didn't even have to play it, they just had to hold it, okay? So if you're ever like, trying to pick out a date or something, and you're looking around, you're like, man, all these people who play musical instruments and can perform and create, or they perform in sports, seem to be having more luck. There is something biological to that. Okay? I will add this. In the experiment, women only picked the guys with the guitars when they were ovulating. So that means when they're possible to get pregnant, right? So they're like, well, if I'm going to get pregnant, I'm going to pick this guy with the guitar. It's perfect timing and all this stuff like this. So there's all these really cool experiments out there where they measure human behavior. Women tend to, no matter what the culture, okay, if you're from a culture where you cover everything up from head to toe, or if you're from a culture where you barely wear, I don't know, a string bikini or whatever, women wore more revealing clothing and put more makeup on when they're ovulating. So, you got, what, did you have a question or did you say really? It's weird. And they don't consciously choose to do it. They're just like, now's the time. I'm looking for Mr. Right. Okay? So, really interesting stuff when you get into human sexual selection. And if you look at what people find attractive, a lot of it is measurements of reproductive fitness. Okay? Start thinking about certain body parts that people find attractive. It's measurement of reproductive fitness. Like, wow, she must be really good at having kids because she has those, traits. All right. Facial hair comes into it a lot too. Wow, he must have a lot of testosterone because he has facial hair. And that facial hair thing goes into women's cycles again. You tend to like guys with facial hair when you're not ovulating, and you like guys without facial hair when you're ovulating. So you're kind of like, I want that big, dark, tall stranger who's maybe a little bit more masculine, but when it comes time to really settle down with a guy, I want one who's going to be nice. So there's so much to it. It's so cool to study it. It's really, really interesting. Just how much of this. And listen, we don't really look at members of the opposite sex and we don't really say like, man, that guy is going to be a really good dad. Okay, we don't normally do that when things we find attractive. Okay? Or man, she has a body that's built for making babies. We don't normally think that, but it is a driving force in our instincts. All right. Let's move on before it gets more awkward than it already is. All right. I'm not going to start this Hardy Weinberg stuff today, so I'm going to go ahead and stop this lecture.